For centuries, we have been fed a romantic fairy tale. A brave Genoese persuaded kings to sponsor a mad adventure for the sake of a sack of pepper and cinnamon. But think about it. Would pragmatic monarchs, barely recovered from wars and climatic chaos, invest huge sums in a maybe without clear guarantees of a return on investment? Columbus was not looking for just anything. He was following specific coordinates. The official version of Columbus's error is a smokescreen to cover the largest corporate raid in history. In reality, the European elites of that time possessed drafts, fragments of ancient maps that survived in monastery cellars after the catastrophes of the Dark Ages. On these maps, the world had been unified 1,000 years before the Spaniards ever sailed. Columbus was not heading into the void of the Indies. He was a spotter. His task was to check whether the old ports, logistics hubs, and supply bases with which connection had been severed when the sky was choked with ash and navigation became impossible, still existed. Columbus did not discover America. He was restoring access to assets that had been on the balance sheets since the days of the Roman Empire. The Age of Discovery was not a scientific search, but an operation to locate civilization's stashes, which had been cut off from Europe for 300 years by a global blackout. How did maps from the early 16th century come to feature the precise outlines of the Antarctic coast, without an ice sheet and a highly detailed coastline of an America that had just been discovered? This was not a gift of foresight, but mundane archival work. In the secret libraries of the Vatican and Portuguese orders, remains of ancient nautical charts, so-called portolans, were preserved. These were documents from an era when the world was global, and Phoenician, Greek, and Roman vessels regularly crossed the oceans. During the climatic collapse of the Dark Ages, celestial navigation became impossible due to atmospheric dust, and these routes turned into legends. However, the maps themselves never disappeared. The famous Piri Reis map is merely a compilation of much older sources that explicitly indicated, beyond the ocean lies solid land with infrastructure. European monarchs outfitted expeditions not out of curiosity, but based on intelligence data thousands of years old that was simply waiting for its moment. Geographical discoveries were not a breakthrough into the unknown, but a large-scale restoration of old routes. Ships left port with copies of maps in their cabins that had been drawn before Europe plunged into medieval darkness. While Europe turned into a freezing graveyard buried in ash, the Western Hemisphere functioned as a giant safe. It preserved resources that had long become myths on the old continent. America's isolation during the Dark Ages became its salvation. While plague and famine decimated cities in Byzantium and Europe, American civilizations, successors to the trade networks shared with antiquity, continued to accumulate resources. The dust veil affected them less, preserving their social structure and, more importantly, their material reserves. For European elites who knew of the existence of Western bases from the archives, America was not a wild forest, but a giant cold storage warehouse. The Spaniards landed on the shore not as colonists, but as burglars who came to crack open a tin can stuffed with gold, food, and a labor force that had not known depletion for the past 300 years. The conquista was not a meeting of worlds, but a seizure of accumulated assets. The old world simply came to collect what was stored on a remote server, while the circuit breakers were blown in the central office. Have you ever wondered why the Incas and Aztecs gave away tons of gold so easily, yet were ready to fight to the death for a cornfield? The answer is simple. For them, it was not currency. For Europe, however, it was the only way to reboot a crashed economy. The gold that the conquistadors seized in the New World was not the result of random finds in streams. These were reserves accumulated over centuries in vaults and temples, essentially the forgotten reserve fund of the ancient global network. In Europe, after the climatic collapse, precious metals physically vanished from circulation. They were either buried in hoards that no one found or exported to the East in exchange for food. The economy stalled. The arrival of the Spaniards in America was like a visit from debt collectors to a debtor who had forgotten his debt. They purposefully emptied warehouses, turning sacred objects into liquid ingots. This gold became the very electricity that restarted Europe's financial system, allowing it to hire armies and build manufactories. The conquistadors behaved not as discoverers, but as liquidators. They were not looking for El Dorado, they were inventorying it, turning the history of entire civilizations into fuel for the European Renaissance. Why sail around the world, losing 90% of the crew, if you can simply trade through intermediaries? Magellan was not a record-breaking adventurer. He was an operative looking for the back door to the blocked bases of antiquity. By the beginning of the 16th century, the main overland trade routes were blocked by hostile empires, and the old maritime routes of the Mediterranean were suffocating under taxes. But ancient archives stated there is a direct water route to the Spice Islands and Pacific logistics centers. Magellan's expedition was an attempt to de-block these routes. He was looking for a specific strait that had been marked on secret maps long before his birth. The passage we call the Strait of Magellan today was a strategic communication hub at the time, a fire escape that allowed one to bypass controlled zones and reach the untouched resources of the East, which continued to function in isolation. The first circumnavigation was not a race for glory, but a test of the planet's backup internet cable. Magellan proved the old global network still exists. You just need to know where the gateway is. Why did the first European settlements in the New World often appear on the sites of strange stone ruins or in perfectly protected bays that wild tribes for some reason ignored? Archaeological inconsistencies and reports from the first expeditions hint that Columbus, Cabot, and Vespucci were not just pointing blindly at a map. Many new cities were built directly on top of foundations that looked suspiciously like ancient masonry. These places were chosen not by intuition, but because they had already served as ports thousands of years ago. Under the climatic chaos of the Dark Ages, these outposts were abandoned, becoming ghost ports. Europeans were simply returning to old docks that had been marked in pre-catastrophe charts as strategic points with deep waters and natural protection from storms. They were not founding colonies. They were rebranding abandoned real estate. The geography of the first colonies is a map of the forgotten branches of a once unified world. The conquistadors landed where piers already existed, hidden under layers of jungle and centuries of dust. The main gold of America was not ingots, but sacks of seeds. Without potatoes and corn, Europe would likely have simply died out from hunger in the next 100 years. By the time of America's discovery, Europe's biological resources were at zero. Traditional grains, wheat and rye, had degraded under the influence of a volatile climate and exhausted soils. But in the American isolators, crops with phenomenal yields and resilience had been bred or preserved from antiquity during that time. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes are not just vegetables. They are high-tech energy packs. Europeans took them as a strategic trophy. It was a true food landing. The introduction of the potato allowed Europe's population to multiply, creating a demographic surplus for future industrialization. We didn't just find food, we siphoned the bioengineering achievements of another part of the world to save our own. The great geographical discoveries were, in essence, a raid for calories. The conquistadors carried gold for kings on their ships, but in their holds they carried seeds that saved the entire European civilization from final hungry collapse. Why did reports about every new island, every bay, and every tribe land first on the Pope's desk, and not just the king's? The Vatican performed the role of a global real estate registrar, checking finds against an ancient registry. In an age when information was more valuable than gold, the Church remained the only legitimate guardian of pre-catastrophe archives. The Vatican held not only theological texts, but also detailed lists of provinces and missions that existed during the unified ancient world. When the Spaniards and Portuguese began discovering new lands, Pope Alexander VI divided the world between them, the famous Treaty of Tordesillas, as if sketching out the map of an old estate among heirs. This was not a gesture of arrogance, it was an inventory. The Vatican knew exactly where the lost peoples and resources should be and coordinated the navigators to restore control over assets that were legally considered the heritage of the empire. The Roman Church did not simply baptize the Indians, it took them back onto the balance sheet. The entire process of discovery was a global audit of property that was located using old inventories after the dark hiatus. We are used to thinking that Europeans brought technology to America and exported only raw materials. But what if it was the other way around? The conquistadors vacuumed up not only temples, but also the surviving keepers of knowledge who had preserved ancient science in its pure form. The knowledge of the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas in astronomy, plant breeding, and medicine amazed the early explorers. Their calendars were more accurate than European ones, and their methods of surgery and pharmacology were more effective. From the perspective of our theory, these were not the achievements of savages. They were the remains of a global scientific layer of antiquity that had degraded more slowly in isolated America than in devastated Europe. The Spaniards methodically seized codices, recipes, and blueprints. Most of them vanished without a trace into the closed archives of the Old World, becoming the basis for the sudden scientific breakthroughs of the Renaissance. We call this the development of European science, but in many ways it was a compilation of stolen knowledge extracted from American oases. The Renaissance in Europe suspiciously coincided with the plundering of American libraries. It seems the light of knowledge was not reignited, but simply transported across the ocean as a trophy of war. Why didn't the vast empires of the Incas and Aztecs build their own fleets and sail to Europe first? After all, they had the resources and the knowledge. The answer lies in the specifics of the climatic collapse. They were not wild, they were forgotten. The global catastrophe of the 6th century did not just choke the sky with ash, it physically severed the planet's communication lines. When celestial navigation became impossible and ocean currents changed due to temperature shifts, the unified world shattered into isolated islands. American colonies, deprived of contact with metropolises and trade partners in Eurasia, found themselves in a state of forced autarky. Over 300 years of isolation, they transformed from high-tech provinces into closed theocracies. They stopped building ships not because they lacked the skill, but because there was nowhere and no reason to sail. The horizon had been shrouded in gloom for centuries. When the Spaniards appeared on their shores, the Indians perceived them not as people from another continent, but as the return of the gods, the restoration of the connection to that very forgotten world mentioned in their legends. The tragedy of the Indians was that they mistook looters for rescuers. They kept gold for those who had once left it, but they were met not by owners, but by marauders who knew where the keys were kept. Labeling inhabited territory as empty or wild is the best legal way to legitimize breaking and entering on a planetary scale. The term discovery was coined by lawyers, not geographers. In the international law of that time, there existed the concept of terra nullius, no man's land. To legally seize resources from the warehouses of the New World, European monarchs had to prove there were no legitimate owners. This is where the myth of uncivilized savages was born. Spanish and Portuguese chroniclers purposefully demonized the Aztecs and Incas, portraying them as bloodthirsty barbarians incapable of self-governance. This allowed the systematic extraction of gold and food to be framed as the white man's burden and a Christian mission. In reality, Europeans understood perfectly well that they were dealing with organized structures. Simply recognizing their agency would have made the seizure of assets illegal. The history of the settlement of America is a long search warrant disguised as a heroic epic. We call it the beginning of a new era, though it was merely a way to nullify the rights of those who guarded the resources during the period of the Great Darkness. The Age of Discovery is not the beginning of a new history, but the epilogue of an old one. It was the moment when humanity finally reached out for its own wreckage and decided to assemble a new empire from it. We are used to regarding 1492 as the starting point of the modern world. But if we face the truth, it was a year of a massive audit. After the climatic chaos of the Dark Ages receded, the surviving players in Europe realized that to build the future, they needed the resources of the past hidden across the ocean. All the progress of subsequent centuries was paid for by Aztec gold, the calories of American crops, and the knowledge rescued from the ruins of the Old World. The great discoveries were merely the second stage of globalization, an attempt to reboot a system that collapsed when the sky was covered in ash. We did not create this world from scratch, we simply successfully expropriated what other civilizations had carefully preserved for us in their tin cans. Columbus and Magellan were not romantics, they were the first logistics managers of the modern era. They proved that the world is one and its resources can be redistributed in favor of those holding the weapons and the old maps. Today, when we speak of a global market, we are merely continuing what these raiders started 500 years ago: the search for new warehouses and the restoration of old routes. Remember, nothing is discovered for the first time. Everything is either restored to memory or seized from the archives. Like this video if you now look at the world map as a property inventory. In the next video, we will break down who actually financed these raids and which other warehouses still remain sealed. Subscribe. Here, history is read through secret protocols, not school textbooks.